Hello, I am the storyteller, and welcome to my channel. I plan to make my own original short stories and narrate them. I'll also be planning to eventually self-publish different short stories on other self-publishing platforms. I hope you'll enjoy my story. The Strange Case of Eli Fritz. Date, August 17th, 1915. I, Dr. Marcus Campbell, am for the record typing down the events that had transpired from the meeting of Mr. Eli Fritz to his unfortunate demise by my hand. I ought to tell the authorities who have been working on the investigation on what happened a little bit about myself before I begin the record. I am a 42-year-old medical doctor for the growing town of Anchor, Michigan, which is located toward the northeast coast. I work out of Ingersoll Hospital, which is situated not far from downtown, for about 12 years. I have seen and treated many ailments, along with injuries like gashes and broken bones. However, in the case of Mr. Fritz, things are going to turn for the unexpected. It was a Friday morning on May 15th that I first meet him, along with his 18-year-old nephew, named Adler, when I walked into the examination room. Mr. Fritz was sitting on the patient table while his nephew was standing next to him. Mr. Fritz was a pale man of 50 years of age and was about 6 feet and 2 inches. A German immigrant he was, which wasn't unusual given that in the late 1800s, the many Germans came to settle in this area along with the Polish and Dutch. His face was stern, and his cold blue eyes piercing, and his black hair began to fade into a pure white. His body was broad and robust, being probably due to his years as a rancher because many farming and ranching lands existed outside of the town. His nephew was a handsome young man, being well built and looked a lot like his uncle, although his face was softer in features and his hair dark brown. I greeted them kindly and shook their hands, which they returned a response. I tried to talk with Mr. Fritz, but Adler had to quickly intervene, explaining that his uncle couldn't speak English very well. Hence, he had to stand in as his interpreter. I was alright about it and began to ask them, "Okay, Mr. Fritz, what brings you in here today?" Adler, in turn, asks his uncle the question, conversing with each other in German. Adler turned to me and said, "Well, my uncle said he came to see you because there's a strange, boil-like lesion on his lower back. It is beginning to worry him because it has not gone away yet, and it has already been over a month." "All right then," I said. "Tell your uncle to take off his shirt, then to turn his back toward me so I may examine it." Adler told his uncle this order. He nodded in response and proceeded to do just that. Needless to say, the boil was a curious sight to behold. It was about the size of a quarter, with its center being a sickening yellow color. At the same time, its outside edges were a swollen dark purple. This wasn't the worst example of a boil, but it was a boil, at least to my knowledge at the time. I told them that it was one and how they needed to treat it at home by applying a warm cloth to it at least 4 to 5 times a day to help it drain. To always be sure to clean it, then place a clean bandage on it to prevent infection. It seemed that Mr. Fritz relaxed a little to that news. I sent them on their way. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. On the morning of May 31st, they came to see me again. This time, I came to find Adler, his face grim with concern, and Mr. Fritz being in worse shape. Eli's piercing blue eyes were now dull, with dark circles around them. His breathing was a bit labored, also. He looked like he was running a fever. I quickly took his vitals, finding his breath elevated, including his heart rate. His temperature was a high 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Adler began to explain to me that his uncle had gotten unsteadily worse over the last 2 weeks. They tried the method I told them to handle the boil, but it had only gotten bigger. Perplexed, I examined Eli's back. I was flabbergasted to see that indeed it grew. It was now the size of my fist, bulging out from his lower back. It was as sickening like before, although something else I noticed developed. It seemed to be pulsing. My eyes narrowed to take a better look. In slight movements, it was indeed pulsing on its own, like a yellow heart. I grabbed a magnifying glass to further examine, which I found the development of small veins, which didn't make any sense. Gingerly, I pressed my fingers around the boil, then on the boil, asking if there was any feeling of pain. In response, Eli nodded. Suddenly, I felt a tiny jab against the boil's skin, like how a child inside the womb of the mother kicks at the touch of one's hands. I jerked my hands back. Unsure of myself, I placed my index finger against the boil again, to only feel it jab, which made me gasp. Hastily, I quickly went to wash my hands, feeling disgusted for the first time in quite a long while. When I came back, Adler asked me, "Dr. Campbell, you felt it, did you?" I turned to look at him, which surprised me. Also, it reaffirmed that this wasn't just my imaginative mind running wild. "Yes, I did," I answered. "Do you know what it could be?" "I will admit, I'm just as dumbfounded as you are right now." I began to rub my head in frustration of what this could be. It certainly wasn't a boil or any kind of known lesion that I had either learned or encountered, although a creepy, more fantastic thought began to prod my mind. What if this boil, this thing, could it be some living organism? I thought. No. I shook my head off to that thought. It was a ridiculous notion, but I still needed to find an answer to this dilemma. "Adler," I said to him, "ask your uncle if he had had his back exposed to anything before noticing the boil." Adler, for a few seconds, shot a look a few times between his uncle and me, beginning to look nervous. He then asked his uncle the question, which Eli responded, "Ja, du kannst ihm sagen," with a weak nod of approval. "Well?" I asked. "I just needed his permission to tell you something," Adler said. "And that is, before I begin, I want you to listen. We are not some superstitious or backwards folk who know nothing. What happened is the truth, and I swear by my parents' graves." Adler then began to describe an incident that happened to them in mid-April. Adler had said it was late one night on a Tuesday. They were walking back from the barn to their home after finishing taking care of their cows. Adler then pointed out to his uncle something falling from out of the sky. It was a small, bright streak of gold, crossing the heavens like Helios in his chariot. They both saw it disappear into the woods that was located behind their land. Quickly, they put more oil in their lanterns and made their way to the woods where they guessed the object had fallen. Walking over fallen tree trunks and ducking under low limbs, they trudged forward into the darkness like a thick curtain, only guided by the lantern lights that shone before them through the twisting woods. It was some time before they entered into a clearing that looked like to have been made by the fallen object. A small crater sunken into the ground with char and ash spread about, with small flickering flames. They proceeded with caution, then shined their lanterns down into the small hole, to find a very peculiar object. It was a large metal sphere about 2 feet in diameter, which was still red hot from its entry into the Earth's atmosphere. At the time, Eli grabbed a branch that was on the ground, and then began to prod the object to see what would happen. There was no reaction from the sphere, not even when Eli struck the orb several times. After some discussion, they then decided to leave and check on it in the morning, turning their backs to go. However, just when they have entered several yards into the woods again, did they then hear the sound of a hiss. They stopped dead in their tracks, then made their way back to the object. They found now that it had mysteriously split open in two, and there appeared to be no contents in the sphere other than a residual slime that oozed a green glow. Bewildered, they just kept staring at it intently until Adler heard his uncle yell next to him, dropping his lantern. He thrashed about, fiercely throwing off his coat, while almost knocking Adler over in the process, screaming at him to get something off his back. Adler said he quickly looked at his uncle's back to find a creature about 1 foot in length and 2 feet in width upon him. He described it as a strange arthropod monstrosity that looked like a spider crab, being rigid and spiked, with 5 limbs on each side of its body. Adler, getting over his initial shock, said he grabbed a large stick, then swiped it off Eli's back. It thumped onto the ground, but before it could recover, Adler viciously beat down on it with a stick. While keeping it at bay, Eli grabbed a sizable rock, then smashed down upon the thing, cracking its shell, killing it. They then kicked the splattered remains into Eli's small lantern's fire, making sure there was none of it to find, because they feared it could have carried some unknown sickness. They quickly made their way out of the woods into their home, where they promptly washed up, and the Adler attended to the injury on Eli's back. There were several small superficial cuts, but there was a strange puncture in the same spot where the boil is now. They both thought nothing of it, other than cleaning it, stitching the dime-sized hole into place, and calling it a night, swearing each other to secrecy unless they needed to tell the story. I was very much skeptical when Adler had finished telling me their tale. It must have even shown up on my face my disbelief that Adler then said, "If you don't believe us, then I'll show you where the sphere is." I replied, saying it was unnecessary, but he insisted. Finally, to humor him, I agreed to go with him to the strange incident. Before we left, I placed Eli under the care of my nurses with instructions for him. I proceeded with Adler into the countryside, about a 2-hour drive in my Model T. We came onto his home, which was small and humble, yet very well made. Their land was marked by wooden fences of several acres, keeping their cattle on their pastures. I stopped my car, and we got off walking to the back of the house, past the green barn. I saw in the distance the dense green woods just beyond the pasture. We trudged our way into the woods, fighting our way past the now overgrown underbrush of vines and bushes. I looked at my watch to find it past 0 o'clock, while amid the sea of trees. I admit I was getting frustrated because I was hungry and very fatigued. I was about to ask Adler if we were there yet, when suddenly he exclaimed, "It's just up ahead, Dr. Campbell." He then pointed a couple yards away. Finally, after one last push, we broke into the clearing. It seems as if nature quickly took back the clearing, although it was still barren and dry around the impact area. Adler motioned to take a look, which I stared down. I saw the half spheres, including the remains of the lantern that burned the creature. I admit, I felt a bit sheepish for misjudging them, as Adler said. "Now you believe us? That whatever it is not of this world?" "Okay, I believe," I said. "I also apologize." "Don't worry, I completely understand," Adler replied. "I don't think I would have believed either if someone else were to tell me the exact same thing. However, I must apologize myself. I admit I was a bit bold." I then accepted his apology. After a quick discussion, Adler and I had formulated a plan. We would head back to his home, eat a late lunch, then while he gathers a couple supplies to move the sphere, I will head back to the hospital to get in contact with a friend of mine. He is Dr. Thompson, a researcher at Janus University, to take a look at it. After a long trek back, and after a hearty lunch, we both set about our business. I came back to the hospital to find it in a state of unrest. Uniformed policemen were present and firemen, while hospital workers with patients were outside. I parked my car near the sidewalk and asked the nearest officer what had happened. He refused to speak to me until I told him I was a doctor who worked here. He glanced around and quickly told me they were called because a patient had gone mad, then began a violent rampage throughout the hospital. He destroyed things, including even hurting hospital staff, and in a couple instances, even killing them with his bare hands. Several witnesses also said he attacked with such incredible ferocity and vigor, they claimed he was possessed by a demon. I asked the officer if the man was still here. The officer said he had burst out of the window after they tried to corner him. They have no idea where he is currently. I asked him if I could confirm the patient's identity by going inside. He grudgingly allowed me, but warned me some places in there were not for the faint of heart. I will spare the gruesome details of what I've seen, but needless to say, I was in horror of the carnage. A nagging suspicion that I had from the story of the officer proved correct. The missing patient that had gone rogue was sadly Mr. Fritz. I had a feeling I knew where he was going now. I quickly rushed out of the hospital to gather a posse of police to follow me. Unfortunately, they were only able to spare 4 to go with me, because the rest were examining the crime scene and were helping the nurses along with the other doctors to tend to the patients. I took them with me in my Model T, their faces grim but willing to apprehend Mr. Fritz. It was nightfall when we finally reached the Fritz household. We all hopped out of my car. 2 officers charged into the back of the house, guns blazing, while one ran off to examine the barn. One stayed with me as we both rushed to the front door of the house. I pounded on it and called for Adler. No sooner we both heard a pair of heavy footsteps rush to the door. The door swung open, revealing Adler. "Finally, Dr. Campbell. I wonder when you were going to finally show." Adler stopped mid-sentence as he glanced to see the officer behind me. "What happened? Why is the policeman here?" "Something is wrong with your uncle," I said. "He's gone mad and running loose." "Ah, what is?" We all heard a loud yell, followed after by a shotgun blast. There was then a horrible and unearthly roar of a creature. "You two," the officer said to us. "Stay here, lock and barricade any of the doors. Don't come out for nothing unless one of us comes to the door to give the all clear." We could hear some more yelling and cursing from the police officers as they fired more shots from their firearms. I quickly locked the front door while Adler began to move the sofa in front of it. "I'll grab my shotgun," Adler said, running to I think his room. In a jiffy he came back with 2 double-barrel shotguns and some shells. "Have you ever used one?" he asked. "On occasion or two shooting clay pigeons," I answered. "Fair enough." He then handed me the other double barrel and began to load, also stuffing shells into our pockets. Suddenly, there was a crashing sound coming from the kitchen, which was toward the back. We hurried over there, guns at the ready. We found a poor officer having been thrown through the window, beaten to a pulp. "Get out of here," he groaned. "He might have hurt it badly, but ain't letting up." He then passed out. I quickly went to go help him, but Adler exclaimed, "Look out, Doc!" when a hulking hand grabbed me by the shirt collar, and one harsh tug brought me outside of the house. I was then dropped like a rag doll to the ground. I looked up to my horror that it was Eli Fritz. However, he looked much different. His pale face was flared up into a red rash, and all the hair on his head was gone. One eye of his had turned into a terrifyingly yellow gloss. All over his body, large veins and blood vessels rippled with increased mass of deformed muscles. It seemed he was hunched over a little bit too, like there was even more on his back. Lastly, his body was covered with buckshot wounds and blood. Doctor? Eli said in a dense, slow voice that was mixed in with his German accent. "Yes, it's me, Mr. Fritz," I said as my voice trembled. "Your uncle," Adler said, stepping outside, his shotgun lowered, which then Eli looked up at him as tears were beginning to form in his eyes. He then slowly sat down onto the ground and started to talk to him in German between heavy breaths. Sadness began to cross Adler's face, but then a look of uncertain acceptance. "What is he saying?" I asked him. "My uncle says he is in unbelievable pain, like molten iron is pulsing through his veins. Not only that, but he also hears a voice in his head." He paused. "He wants me to kill him before it takes over him completely." He slowly walked over and hesitantly raised the shotgun to Eli's head. Tears welled up in his eyes as he lowered the gun again. "But I just can't do it," Adler said. "I just can't kill the only family I have left." "Finish it," Eli said. "My boy." My heart couldn't take it. I got up and said to Adler, "Give me the gun and I'll do it. I'll make sure to make it quick." Adler looked at me, then at his uncle, to which Eli then slowly nodded. Adler gave me the double barrel, and I walked around Eli. Eli's back was crusted over like a back shell of a crab. The boil had gotten into the size of a dinner plate, and I could see now another organism growing inside of him. A parasitic relationship, I thought. I then slowly raised the double barrel to the back of his head. I hesitated and said, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Fritz." Then I pulled the trigger. Boom. Eli's body jerked and slowly fell to the ground. Adler was softly sobbing. Again, I took aim at the boil this time and fired the other shell, killing the organism in a splatter of matter. Poor Eli Fritz died by my hand, which was the only thing that I could do to help him. Afterward, though, with much pain, Adler and I both decided to burn Eli's body. The reasoning was Adler didn't want any authority to pick and probe his uncle's body, which I understand. Since then, Adler and I have successfully brought the sphere to Janus University for Dr. Thompson to study. We have yet to hear any findings from him. Thank you for watching. This has been The Storyteller. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you would like, you can go to my Buy Me a Coffee page to buy me a cup of tea. Any kind of support is much appreciated. Link to it is in the description below.